Edwin R. Guthrie. Guthrie was born in 1886 and died in 1959. He was professor of psychology at the University of Washington from 1914 until his retirement in 1956. His basic work was his book entitled The Psychology of Learning, which was published in 1935 and revised in 1952. His style of writing is easy to follow, humorous, and involves many homespun anecdotes to exemplify his ideas. There are no technical terms or mathematical equations, and he firmly believed that his theory, or any scientific theory for that matter, should be stated so that it could be understood by any college freshman. He placed a great emphasis on practical application of his ideas, and in this regard was very much like Thorndike. He was not really an experimentalist himself, although he certainly had an experimental outlook and orientation. He did only one experiment that related to his theory of learning. He was, however, a rigid behaviorist. As a matter of fact, he felt people like Thorndike, Pavlov, and J.B. Watson were too subjective, and that by carefully applying the law of parsimony, or Occam's razor, to learning, it's possible to explain all learning phenomena by using one principle. In general, all learning theories can be thought of as attempts to determine rules by which stimuli and responses are associated. The rules that had been generated by people like Thorndike and Pavlov were unnecessarily complicated, and in their place, Guthrie proposed one law of learning, the law of contiguity. It is as follows. A combination of stimuli which has accompanied a movement will, on its reoccurrence, tend to be followed by that movement. Another way of stating the same thing is to say that if you did something in a given situation, the next time you are in that situation, you will tend to do the same thing. In addition to this one law of learning, Guthrie said that learning was complete in one trial, and this one trial learning principle can be stated as follows. A stimulus pattern gains its full associative strength on the occasion of its first pairing with a response. Still another principle that is more or less a derivative of his one law of learning is the recency principle. The recency principle is as follows. That which was done last in the presence of a stimulus will be that which will be done when the stimulus combination next recurs. Those three statements, the statement of contiguity, the statement concerning one trial learning, and the recency principle, are all that is needed, according to Guthrie, to explain all learning, whether it's classical or instrumental, complicated or simple. These three statements supposedly cover the entire area of learning. One question that may come to mind concerning these claims is that if learning is complete in one trial, as Guthrie says it is, why does practice bring about improvement? In order to answer this question, Guthrie says we must differentiate between acts and movements. We must differentiate between a skill or an act and specific movements. A skill is made up of many acts, and acts are made up of many movements. The relationship between one set of stimuli and one movement is learned at full strength in one trial, but this does not bring about proficiency at a skill. For example, driving a car or typewriting, playing baseball, or any sport are all very complicated skills consisting of a large number of stimulus-response associations, and any one of these bonds or associations is learned at full strength in one trial. But it takes time and practice for all the necessary associations to be made. Learning to type letter A while looking at letter A on a written sheet of paper alongside the typewriter might consist of a specific stimulus-response connection. Looking at the letter B and typing the letter B is another one, looking at C and so forth throughout the entire alphabet, and then the same thing is done for numbers, and then the capital letters, and all the other symbols that occur on the typewriter. Then all these responses must be learned under specific circumstances, for example, under different lighting conditions, under different temperature conditions, under different angles of seeing the material, typing on different kinds of paper, and whether you're typing from typewritten or handwritten copy. All these things must be learned individually, and when they are, we say the person has become a proficient typist. So the skill of typing involves an enormously large number of specific SR connections, each of which is learned in a single trial. Another question that might come to mind concerning Guthrie's theory of learning concerns the nature of reward. What is the place of reward or reinforcement in Guthrie's theory? It is on this particular matter that Guthrie took issue with Thorndike. As you remember, Thorndike made the revised law of effect the cornerstone of his theory. The revised law of effect stated that learning depended upon the outcome of an act, and some outcomes were considered to be satisfying. When a response led to a satisfying state of affairs, its probability of reoccurring went up. Guthrie felt that this was completely unnecessary and unparsimonious. For Guthrie, reward is merely a mechanical arrangement, which he felt could be explained very nicely using his one law of learning. Reward or reinforcer, according to Guthrie, terminates the stimulating conditions and thereby prevents unlearning. For example, in a Skinner box, the last thing the animal does before receiving a reward is to press the lever. Because receiving the reward changes the whole stimulus pattern in the Skinner box, the recency principle applies. In other words, the last thing the animal did under the pre-reward conditions is to press the lever. Therefore, in accordance with the recency principle, when he is placed back into that situation, he will tend to press the lever again. So we must think in terms of a stimulus pattern that either continues or is changed. And what Guthrie is saying here is that the stimulus pattern in the Skinner box maintains itself until something changes it. It is more or less the same until some radical event occurs, and when that event occurs, the stimulating conditions are changed, and the response attached to the stimulating conditions that existed before the event occurred is preserved. In order to exemplify this point, Guthrie did his only experimentation to shed light on his theory. He and Horton did experiments with cats in what they called a puzzle box, which was very similar to the apparatus that Thorndike used in his selecting and connecting experiments. What Guthrie and Horton observed was a great deal of stereotyped behavior on the part of any given animal. They had a large number of cats, and they noted that each cat learned to solve the problem in his own peculiar way, which was the way that that particular animal had hit upon just prior to being released from the box. Applying Guthrie's notions of reward to the puzzle box experiment, we have the following situation. We have a chamber, or a puzzle box, that has a pole sticking straight out from the floor. And when the animal hits the pole, the door of the puzzle box immediately opens, thereby allowing the animal to leave the chamber. What Guthrie noted was that whatever the particular manner was in which a particular cat hit the pole, that was the response that was learned. Cat A would hit the pole by backing into it, and when he backed into the pole, the door flew open, and he left the chamber. Guthrie would say that the door flying open was an abrupt change in the stimulating conditions. Because you're changing the stimulating conditions, you're preventing that response to that pole from being unlearned. The last thing that the animal did before the chamber was opened was to back into that pole. Because when he backed into it, the stimulating conditions changed, applying the law of recency, the next time we put the animal in the puzzle box, he should respond by backing into the pole, and that is exactly what Guthrie and Horton observed. They also observed a very unusual thing from the standpoint of a reinforcement theorist. They observed that very often the animal, after escaping from the box, would ignore the so-called reward. The reward was fish, and very often the animal would just ignore the fish, although his performance in leaving the puzzle box on subsequent trials was very proficient. This, according to Guthrie, added further support to his contention that reward is merely a mechanical arrangement that prevents unlearning. It can be concluded that any event following the desired response from an animal would change the stimulating conditions and thereby preserve that response under those conditions. For example, it should be possible, according to Guthrie, to bring about learning by simply removing an animal after a bar press in a Skinner box. No further so-called reward should be necessary. This experiment was tried by a man named Seward, and he did not confirm Guthrie's notions. There were extenuating circumstances, however, that we will mention in a moment. The concepts of drive and motive are also handled by Guthrie's notion of contiguity learning. There is nothing that worries Guthrie about such complex processes. He feels that they can be explained in accordance with 3 statements about learning that we mentioned earlier. Drives provide what Guthrie called maintaining stimuli that keep the animal active until a goal is reached. For example, being hungry produces internal stimulation that continues until food is obtained. When food is obtained, the maintaining stimuli is terminated, and therefore the stimulating conditions have changed, thus preserving the response that led to food. You can see some similarity here between maintaining stimuli and the situation we just talked about with the animal in the Skinner box. Maintaining stimuli from drives must be considered along with external stimulation when predicting an animal's behavior. This could be the reason why Seward's experiment failed. He did not take into consideration the presence of maintaining stimuli, which are internal and not external. He was terminating the external stimulation by taking the animal out of the Skinner box following a bar press response, but he was neglecting the stimulation that was coming from within the animal's body. They both must be taken into consideration because, being sources of stimulation, there are responses conditioned to both maintaining stimuli and external stimuli. Responses that are conditioned to maintaining stimuli are called intentions. They're called intentions because maintaining stimulation usually lasts for a long period of time. The duration is not as short as it is with external stimulating conditions. So the responses conditioned to the stimulation coming from the hunger drive, for example, seem to be in some kind of logical sequential order, and the behavior conditioned to the stimulation looks intentional. That is, it looks goal-directed. Also, punishment offers no problem for Guthrie. As a matter of fact, his statements concerning punishment are very profound and explain things that up until the time of his theory were very mysterious. He says the effectiveness of punishment is determined by what it causes the organism to do, and it must occur in the presence of the cues that cause the punished behavior. Punishment works when it works, and it doesn't always work, not because of the pain experienced by the individual, but because it changes the way he responds to certain stimuli. Only when the punishment results in a new response to the same stimuli is it effective. So you must always look at what the punishment makes the individual do and when it makes him do it. If punishment succeeds in changing the punished habit, it must be because it elicits behavior incompatible with the punished behavior. If the punishment fails, it's because the behavior caused by it is not incompatible with the punished behavior. Let's say, for example, you have a dog that chases cars and you find this to be undesirable. Guthrie would say, get in your car and allow the dog to chase it. As he is running alongside, reach down and slap his nose. This is likely to be effective. On the other hand, if you slap his rear as he's running, that is likely not to be effective, although it can be assumed that the two are equally painful as far as the dog is concerned. But the slap on the nose tends to make him stop and jump backward, and the slap on the rear tends to make him continue forward, perhaps even a little bit more energetically. So slapping the dog's nose while he's chasing a car creates behavior incompatible with the undesired response of chasing cars, whereas slapping him on the rear does not. This is something to be looked at very carefully before deciding to use punishment to change behavior. To summarize, punishment must cause behavior that is incompatible with the punished behavior, and it must cause that incompatible behavior in the presence of the stimuli that led to the punished behavior. Then, because of one-trial learning, the same stimuli will henceforth elicit the desired behavior. For example, let's say a child is attracted to a hot stove and touches it. The pain will cause the child to withdraw from the stove while still looking at it. So the response of withdrawal becomes attached to the side of the stove and displaces the approach response. Henceforth, when the child sees the stove, he will tend to avoid it rather than to approach it. Since learning occurs in one trial, so does forgetting. According to Guthrie, all forgetting occurs merely by causing an alternative response in the presence of a stimulus pattern that previously elicited another response. After causing that alternative response in the presence of a stimulus pattern, that pattern will tend to elicit the new response. Therefore, all learning must involve new learning. As a matter of fact, Guthrie's theory of forgetting is an extreme form of retroactive inhibition. Retroactive inhibition refers to the fact that the memory of previous learning is interfered with by learning something new. When you learn something new, it interferes with what you have already known. Guthrie takes the extreme position which states that whenever you learn something new, it must completely block out something old. There is a complete replacement of what preceded the new learning. If, for example, stimulus 1 tends to elicit response 1, and you present stimulus 1, and you prevent response 1 and allow response 2, thereafter, when stimulus 1 is presented, response 2 will occur in an all or none fashion. Now if you present stimulus 1 again and prevent response 2, and instead allow response 3, then the next time stimulus 1 is presented, response 3 will occur, and so forth. All forgetting, according to Guthrie, is due to this replacing of old responses with new ones. The next question is, how do we go about weakening undesirable habits? We already saw that using punishment is one way. Guthrie lists 3 other ways. The first he called the threshold method. The threshold method can be exemplified by what is ordinarily done when a horse is being broken. If you walk up to a full-grown horse that has never had a saddle on it before and attempt to throw a saddle on its back, he'll go through some very abrupt patterns of behavior, such as kicking and running. He will do whatever he can to prevent you from putting the saddle on his back. However, if instead of taking the saddle, you take a blanket, a very light blanket, and put it on his back, chances are that he won't kick at all. If he doesn't, you very gradually increase the weight of the blanket, and as long as he doesn't react, you keep approximating the real saddle in small steps, and gradually you build up to the saddle itself. This is called the threshold method of breaking a habit. There is a process akin to this in clinical psychology. If the therapist is trying to help a patient try to overcome a fear of some person, there may be this kind of approximation to dealing with that fear. If a person has a terrible fear of one of his relatives, for example his mother, the therapist may first start out talking about people in general, then about women, and then about women who are related to the patient, and then gradually build up to the point where they are actually talking about the mother. This again is using the threshold method of breaking a habit. The second method proposed by Guthrie is referred to as the fatigue method. Again, to take the horse training situation as an example, the fatigue method would correspond to bronco busting, where you just throw the saddle on the horse and climb up and ride the animal until he gives up. That is, until he is so fatigued that he is doing something other than bucking while the saddle and the rider are on his back. Then, according to Guthrie, this response of riding calmly will replace the bucking response in reaction to the stimulus provided by the saddle and the rider in an all-or-none fashion. Once you get the animal to act this way, in the presence of that stimulation, he will continue to do so. Likewise, if you have a dog that chases chickens, all you have to do, according to Guthrie, is to tie a chicken around the dog's neck and let him run around and try to get rid of it. The dog will eventually become fatigued and give up. When he does, the chicken will become a cue for avoidance rather than for chasing. Whatever the animal did last in the presence of those stimulating conditions is what he will tend to do in the future when those stimulating conditions recur. Since in this case, the last thing the dog did in the presence of a chicken was not to chase it, next time he sees a chicken, he will tend to avoid it. Another example that Guthrie uses in describing the fatigue method is a little girl who upsets her parents by lighting matches. Guthrie's advice is just to allow the girl, even force the girl, to continue to light matches even beyond the point where it is fun anymore. The matches will become something to be avoided rather than to be approached. The third method is called the incompatible response method. Here the stimuli which cause an undesired response are presented along with other stimuli that can be counted on to produce an incompatible response. One example would be giving a young child a toy like a panda bear. This is the first panda bear that the child ever had, and its first reaction to it is one of fear and avoidance. Now we have the stimulus of the bear eliciting a fear response on the part of the child. On the other hand, the mother elicits a warm, relaxed feeling on the part of the child. Using the incompatible response method, you pair the mother and the bear. The mother picks up the bear and allows the child to experience her and the bear together. Since under these conditions the mother will be the dominant stimulus, the reaction to the bear and mother together should be one of relaxation. Once this reaction has been elicited in the presence of the bear, you can present the bear alone, and the child will react to it the same as he did when the mother was present. Thus, the fear is overcome. Essentially, the fundamental rule for breaking a habit is to discover the cues that elicit the undesirable reaction, and then to practice a different response to the same cue. This, as you probably know, is much easier said than done. Breaking a habit can be a very difficult process. Witness anyone trying to give up smoking. It might be an interesting exercise to apply the three methods of breaking a habit that we just went over to the breaking of the smoking habit and see if there is any useful practical advice. Remember, however, that smoking is a response that has been conditioned to millions of stimuli. Guthrie would probably say that if you have become in your mind an undesirable individual, that is, if you have accumulated a large number of behavior patterns that are not effective or cause a great deal of concern and anxiety, probably the best thing you could do would be to leave the situation altogether. He would say, go to an environment that would give you a fresh start. You would not have as many SR bonds or associations built up in a new environment, and it would release you, so to speak, to develop a number of new reactions and a number of new behavior patterns. It would only be a partial escape, however, since many of the things that would be causing your behavior are internal. The maintaining stimuli and all the responses that have been conditioned to the maintaining stimuli will be taken along with you when you leave. But it seems at least you're giving yourself a chance by escaping from an environment in which a number of unfortunate SR associations have been built up. What happens when rather than trying to break an unfortunate habit, you want to strengthen a desirable habit? Guthrie would say, use as many stimulus supports for your desired behavior as possible. Practice this desired behavior under a wide variety of circumstances, because when you do this, a large number of stimulus supports will tend to elicit that behavior. That is, the desired behavior will become associated with a large number of cues. It is for precisely this reason, according to Guthrie, that a habit like smoking is so very difficult to break. Smoking becomes associated with many cues under a wide variety of circumstances, and to break the smoking habit is to break all these many associations that have been made between stimulating conditions and the response of smoking. The same principle works in strengthening a desired habit. The more cues that you associate with a given act, the stronger it will become. That is, it will tend to be elicited by a large number of stimuli. Thus, Guthrie would say, if you find certain behavior patterns to be desirable, then you should repeat them under a wide variety of circumstances. Next, we turn to Guthrie's thoughts on the transfer of training. It should be clear that Guthrie would expect very little transfer of training. He would say that if a little girl learns to add 2 and 2 at the blackboard, there is no guarantee that that child is going to know how to add 2 and 2 when she returns to her seat. The stimulating conditions at the blackboard are much different than those prevailing at her seat, so she really must learn the response of adding 2 and 2 at the blackboard, at her seat, at home, and wherever she hopes to practice that response. That particular example can be generalized to any learning situation. For example, Guthrie would say to the college student, if you want to get the most out of your studies, you should practice in exactly the same situation that you're going to be tested in. and he means that literally. The best place to study is where you're going to be tested, because then all the stimulus supports in that room will be associated with the information that you're studying. If you learn something in your dorm room, there is no guarantee that the knowledge will transfer into the classroom. This is how he would explain the student who after a test says, "I don't know what happened to me. I went over that material 100 times. I knew it quite well, and yet it didn't come to me during the test." Guthrie would say that there simply was not enough in common between the conditions under which the student studied and the conditions under which he was tested. So according to Guthrie, we should always practice, insofar as it's possible, not only the exact behaviors that are going to be demanded of us later, but we should practice in the exact conditions under which we are going to use that behavior. If you want to utilize information beyond a testing situation, then of course you must go beyond the classroom and start associating more and more stimulus prompts to the behavior that the book or the class or the lecture caused you to do. So what is Guthrie's advice to the student who is going to be writing essay questions? In studying and preparing for the test, write essay questions. Sit down and write them, make them up, guess at what they're going to be, and write them out. Time yourself, force yourself to learn the response under the time conditions that will prevail during the test. He would say the same thing about the automobile mechanic or the electrician or whatever. If you want to learn how to fix engines, then work on engines, and work on them under the conditions that are similar to those prevailing in real-life situations. In this way, transfer is maximized. Guthrie would be opposed to overviews, and he probably wouldn't even use the words understanding or insight. It's all learning by doing. We learn what we do. Perhaps that's the best way to summarize our discussion of Guthrie. Whatever the person did last in a situation is what he will do again, right or wrong, next time the situation comes about. We do not learn by success, according to Guthrie. We simply learn by doing. With that, we will conclude our discussion of Guthrie's theory of learning.